Yeah, okay, let's get started. Third week in a row. Previous weeks have been about cross-exchange market making and finding opportunities, and one about liquidity. Today we'll be building a little bit on top of that, but it's more about like how do you monitor bots and how you can actually track markets at a larger scale, and how we are doing that for some of the clients. So this one is about how to monitor servers, bots, and market data using Hummingbot, Influx database, and Grafana. So this shouldn't look too unfamiliar because this is what I talked about previously, right? Like this is whenever a token gets listed, we look at, their graphs, and we often see markets like these. When we then look at CoinGecko, we observe these type of like images, right? Where there's a large spread, not a lot of liquidity in general. And that, allows us to actually start tracking the token using Hummingbot, Influx database, and Grafana, and visualize the liquidity over time, which is something I will show. And I'll show you kind of like a piece of the code, and I'll explain what type of metrics it is that we look at in terms of liquidity to kind of do a deeper assessment on what, good liquidity is and what liquidity looks over time. Because again, a CoinGecko is just a snapshot, but of course it's interesting to see how that liquidity is kind of like developing over time. Not only it's used for, tracking market data, but you can also, of course, track the bot, Linux servers. You can track Docker images. You can track, monitor Kubernetes instances as well. What we're going to talk about today is currently what type of data is available in Hummingbot and where is that being tracked in the code base. Then how do we monitor servers, Docker instances, bots, and, markets, and what could that be used for? A little bit about the Influx database, Grafana implementation, the market and liquidity breakdown that we have, and then some use cases, like what could be other use case of why you want to track this data. So what Hummingbot currently has is that information like open orders, order creation, order cancels, funding rate payments, order fills is all stored by default in an SQLite database, which is in the data folder in the Hummingbot folder by default. You can select or allow Hummingbot to send the data to like an SQL database that is hosted by AWS or any other service provider. That's an option, so you have it hosted in the cloud. But by default, trades is also stored as a CSV. By default, everything is sent to an SQL database. But you might want to have way more information, and I'm not sure if an SQL database is the right database to send these metrics to for a couple reasons. If you want to figure out what type of data and how that works, what type of data is sent to this SQL database or SQLite database, you can go to your Hummingbot connectors and then market recorder .py file where you can find the implementation of it. I'm not going to talk about it too much because I want to talk about the Influx database and the implementation we have. If you run a more professional service and you want to scale things up, there are a couple things you want to monitor, right? It's not only the bot, but generally speaking, you can have a Kubernetes implementation, which has a really easy implementation and integration with Grafana, so you can monitor everything at once. But most of you guys probably run a Linux server on which you either run it from source or you run it on a Docker container, and a Docker container has the Hummingbot instance inside of that. So first of all, it's important to monitor the Linux server, like CPU utilization. If it's even up and running, you need to know the RAM over time and these type of like metrics. What Grafana is then used for is a really easy implementation with the Linux server, where you simply just run a Docker image that sends information to this Grafana instance, where you can visualize and also create alerts for whenever things go wrong on this Linux server. The second thing that you can do is you can have the same type of information per Docker image. So you measure the performance of the Docker image with a really easy integration with Grafana. So that doesn't, you don't need a lot of skill in order to visualize and analyze and track your Docker performance over time. Especially at least if you run it on Grafana Cloud, which is just a hosted server where it's really easy to integrate it. But what we use, and this is something that is you need a custom solution for, is also being able to monitor the performance of your strategy of your bot but also be able to, record some market data like 2% depth and spread over time to analyze what's happening in the market and to see for us as a market maker if there's enough depth and that we're meeting the requirements in terms of spread over time. And how we do that, while most of the information is just sent from the Linux server and the Docker instance directly to Grafana and analyzed in a visualized in a dashboard, we have another implementation for the Hummingbot bot performance and market data performance. Because what we do, we send the data first to an Influx database, which is a time series database, and then we visualize that using Grafana. There's an easy integration for that. And what is really easy is we can create alerts on Grafana. So whenever things go wrong in the bot, or for example, our profit and loss is too large, we just get custom alerts and we can analyze what is happening from there. If we're underperforming in terms of how much depth we need to provide as a market maker, we get all those alerts on our phone and we can take action from there, which is really important for our service. But again, this is also what we also do is we just simply track liquidity on exchange, which is what I'm going to show in a bit. Not because we're trading on that exchange, but just because we want to analyze what the liquidity looks like of a certain project. And then it follows this process again, where we send certain metrics using a custom strategy or a custom script, send metrics to an Influx database, and we visualize it here. A little bit about Influx database. So an Influx database, a time series database, and it probably works way better for this type of time series data that we have, because I mean, all the data that we send is, collected on every second or every couple seconds. So it's time series based. Normally, an Influx database is mostly used for IoT monitoring and visualizing the data, and it's really good at handling a lot of data and a lot of querying and visualizing this data as well. Using, for example, Grafana, but Grafana is just a implementation that you could use or a tool that you could use in order to visualize this data. You can also just query it and extract the data and use it for whatever you want to use, for example, machine learning. And the key benefit of this is especially that it has a more advanced query language. So if you use SQL, there are probably things you can do in SQL that you can do with this Flux query language that is more, focused on time series. And then you can create beautiful looking dashboards like these based on this time series. This is, I think, a dashboard that is used for monitoring the performance of the Linux server, but I'll show you another example of a dashboard that we have created in order to monitor, markets and liquidity over time, and what the use cases are for this. And it's really simple, actually, in order to do so. So you guys are probably busy building scripts where every tick something happens, right? And every tick, what we do is we collect certain metrics, and I'll explain a little bit, a couple metrics that we track, and we send the data to an Influx database. This Influx database is just hosted in the cloud. We pay for that, and you can get it on AWS Marketplace. So it's not an AWS product, but it's on the marketplace. So you just get billed by AWS rather than having another party that bills you. Really easy. You can easily set it up. You need a token, which basically an API key, an organization, URL, bucket, which is kind of like where you want to store it. And you import some libraries. You have a client and you have a write client, basically. Then you create so-called points, which has a name, a tag to categorize, for example, the exchange we have this data for and the trading pair. But it could also be a certain strategy name, for example. That could also be another tag. And you have fields, and fields is just, some information that is associated with this trading pair and this exchange in this case. And this point we use in order to analyze or store public trade data. So whenever a public trade happens, we calculate some metrics and we send an information to an Influx database and analyze it later. For example, we have the site here, whether it's a buy or a sell. We have the price here. We have the amount. So we also know the 24-hour volume, for example. And we also calculate the slippage that has happened on that public trade. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then you simply write it. So to simply say, you can create a script or a strategy. Script is probably the easiest, that just collects metrics that you compute out of the order book or anything else and just send it to this database so you can query and visualize it later or create alerts based on that. We do this every second. And one of our instances, we can add, 5 exchanges and 12 pairs per exchange, and it just manages it all in once. I mean, at one point you might need a second instance to really scale up, but at least we can monitor around like 15 to 20 pairs with one single instance, because we just use a for loop in order to do all these metric calculations and sending it to this database. Some of the things that we measure, I mean, there are 2 things we measure, right? We want to know the bot performance. So things like, the amount of open orders we have on the exchange at all times, especially it's useful for us as a market maker, because our job is to put orders on the order book to provide liquidity. Often, anywhere between like 20 to 50 orders on the book. So we need to know how many we do at all times. Whenever it drops below a certain threshold, we might need to take action. So we get an alert because we have all this information in the Influx database, and it queries every 5 seconds to see if certain, thresholds are still met. We need to know the open order volume that we are providing. We need to know, for example, balance information over time, just the balance in general, but also the, total balance and free available balance. We calculate an hourly delta P&L, a 5-minute delta P&L, an overall delta P&L we have on our trading, in order to know how the P&L develops over time, but also to know that if the delta P&L, in 5 minutes drops below a certain threshold, that means that something is happening and that we need to probably look at, what is happening. We want to know, for example, out of all of our filled orders on the order book, and this is a really interesting metric that we have, from all the open orders that we have, and if they're filled, we send this data to the Influx database. And the SQL server inside of Hummingbot does this as well. But one metric that we wanted to add was the slippage that is happening on that trade. And how we calculate it is that every time we have an order fill at, for example, this price here, this self-fill, we calculate, hey, what was the previous mid price? And if we have that, we know the slippage that has happened on the trade. So at what spread was this order filled? It's really interesting to know and interesting to see that information for your own trades, but also for the public trades that is happening. And the last implementation that you can have is, there's way more, of course, but you can have all your logs that are stored on the server, on the Linux server. You can even send them to Grafana and display them there in one single instance. So you don't have to go into bots anymore to monitor them and see the logs, but you can just simply look at your Grafana instance and have all the information that you need, including the logs over there. And you can create custom metrics out of these, right? For example, if you want to know the amount of disconnects that is happening with an exchange, you can create an alert for that, or you can count those based on the log information that is Hummingbot is sending to the Grafana instance. It depends on if you're using Grafana Cloud or you're hosted yourself, that you need to do some extra handling. It's done with Loki, but you'll figure it out once you read a little bit more about that. Public data, which I'll show you guys in a bit. What we, for example, track is spread over time, and this is not bot related, right? We have an instance running, but it's not a strategy that we run like pure market making. This is just public data that we want to track over time for projects, or to analyze their liquidity, or sometimes even to just, see how their market maker is performing currently. So we have spread information, public trade slippage. Again, for every trade that happens, we calculate what is the slippage on that trade. This is not only useful for analyzing the quality of the liquidity, but also for you to better understand what is the average slippage that is happening on the trade. So how should I set my pure market making settings? And I'll show that in a bit. 2% depth, 5% depth, and 10% depth is what we track. We have a candlestick chart. We analyze public trades. We analyze the amount of orders that are within 2%, just to see how many order levels there are. And I actually have an example of that. So just an example of what are the things that we track, but it might also be interesting to look at, how do we look at liquidity and why do we track these metrics? Because these metrics are a signal of what is good liquidity and what is not good liquidity. So if I go back to this dashboard. Let me move you guys to the corner. So yeah, there's a couple, this is a day worth of data. And again, this is what we have tracked with a script or a strategy in Hummingbot that tracks for 5 different exchanges in total, around like 15 markets, and send all this information per market to an Influx database. And using the Flux query language and Grafana, we visualize this information here. We can select different exchanges that we have tracked it for a token. We have candlestick timeframes that we can set here, and we have the data aggregation. We can even, if we zoom in, we can even see what the spreads are at a specific second. This is all aggregated for the past 5 minutes on average, or minimum maximum. So first of all, we have a candlestick chart, which is pretty basic, right? Everyone probably understands what this means. But what is really interesting is to see the spread over time for projects and how that develops and how that kind of correlates with something that's happening in the market, for example. We often say for small and mid-cap projects, you need at least a spread within 0.7 or 0.5 for mid-cap projects. And we kind of analyze that over time. Preferably, spread is consistent and does it not so choppy up and down. That means there's no predictability in spread, which is not really, nice for traders that want to interact with your project or token. Of course, the spread is really important because the spread is what, anyone who interacts with your token is paying, at least to place a trade of at least $1. The lower the spread is, the less they pay, the less the cost for them is, the more easy it is for them to buy and sell tokens, the more likely they are to interact with your project and use the token for whatever use case it is, right? The other 2 graphs here are really interesting, which is the trade slippage over time and the trade slippage as like a histogram. And this is the public trade. So over every public trade, we calculate like, hey, it was filled at this price. The previous mid price was here. That's a slippage that someone has over, of X%. And we send that information to Influx database as well. What we can, for example, see is that here someone traded at a maximum 2.5% spread, meaning that the mid price is here. The last fill of that order was 2.5% above that. And these 2 metrics are really interesting because they kind of show the quality of liquidity that's on the exchange. It's quite like a summary of it. Because if your spread is really tight and your order book is really deep, you will probably not see a lot of slippage happening on this trade. What we can see here is that most of the slippage is happening within the 48 basis points, which is not too good, but it's okay. But some of these trades are happening, above a 1% slippage, etc., which is not ideal. One thing that's interesting, we can even see if people are wash trading here by looking at this chart, because we see a lot of orders or trades happening with 0% slippage, which is almost impossible in theory, because if the spread is 1%, you cannot have a 0% slippage unless someone is wash trading. If we track multiple markets here, the best bid and ask per market to see if there are market inefficiencies or arbitrage opportunities. And again, on this one here, this one is really useful because here if we know that there are some trades happening at a 1.5% slippage, that means if we would set our bid or ask spread at 1.5, we can kind of analyze how many trades we will get on average, how many fills we will get. We know that if we set it to 2%, that we might only get 1 trade in this day. Well, if we would set our bid and ask spread to, let's say, 0.5%, we will get way more trades. So you can kind of analyze that in a way. So it's not only used for monitoring the performance of the market or the market maker, but also, it could be used for, knowing how to set your, parameters for the strategy. This last ones that we see here, I'll quickly go over it. We know what we track here is for the order book depth. So the mid price, 0.5% above that, 1% above that, 2% above that, 5 and 10. We count and stack the amount of orders on the bid side and also on the ask side. So we know how many order levels are in the order book. We do the same for order book depth within 2, 0.5, 1, 5, and 10%. So we know how much liquidity is within those depths. And here, this is probably a better overview. Here we see it per depth, basically. So, for example, the 2% depth, which is the same depth what we see on CoinGecko as well, which is a really important metric. This explains like how much liquidity, how many open order volume is there within the mid price and 2% above and below that. We're looking at two things mainly in liquidity. It's availability, so how much is the depth in general, and we're looking at consistency, meaning you can have generally sometimes 2K of liquidity, but if then it all of a sudden drops to $100, for example, then it's not consistent. And consistency is important, and availability is important, because the more you have available, the more inclined traders are to trade in large sizes because they don't have a lot of slippage. So there's an incentive for them to trade in large sizes and interact with your project. Yeah, let me go back. So this is the nice thing is we can track anything that we can take a metric out, right? So if you want to track the correlation between Bitcoin and other assets, then you just set up a tracker for Bitcoin and all the other assets. So you create a graph out of that. If you want to measure the order book depth, the imbalance in order book from the bid compared to the ask, and chart that, you can easily do that by creating a metric, or you just calculate within Grafana itself. If you want to know the spread, I mean, this is the best bid and ask spread, right? But if you want to know the spread, if you exclude the first $100 orders in there, you can compute that in Hummingbot using the order book and excluding the first $100 of the order book, and then compute the spread and send that information to Influx database. So you're not limited to any, whatever you can build in Hummingbot, you can send it here, but Grafana is just a really good tool to do it, to analyze it. So it's not only for analyzing and benchmarking liquidity, like how we use it for token projects, and for our internal tracking of how our bots are performing. It's not only for benchmarking market makers to see how they're performing and how they are providing liquidity, and if they're doing a good job or a bad job. It's not only for managing bots and strategies, but it's for any logic or any metric that can be created. You can just display it. Another example could be analyzing market inefficiencies. So you can send data whenever there's an arbitrage opportunity or for cross-exchange market making purposes. You can use it for knowing how to set your pure market making parameters in order to generate a profit. And, as you send the data to Influx database, you can also take it out of Influx database to use for any machine learning or data analysis to find correlation between assets and everything. Because it might be an Influx database, but it doesn't mean you can't take it out, right? And it's interesting, right? Because it doesn't mean that we have to send data every second. You can also, have some custom logic that checks if some conditions are met. And if those conditions are met, you'll start sending certain metrics to the Influx database. And if those conditions are not met, then you don't do it. A good example of that is, if you are spotting an arbitrage opportunity, you start sending data to Influx database. And then if the arbitrage opportunity is gone, you stop tracking it. And then in the end, you can see how many arbitrage opportunity there's been over a certain time by just plotting that in Grafana. So don't limit yourself to whatever I'm telling you here. Anything can be done. And that's, I think, the essence of this presentation I'm giving here, that anything can be built. And that's it for this. This one is a little bit shorter than the other ones. Thanks again. Here's some information of where you can find me, and I'm always happy to chat. We have recently started a knowledge base. Happy to get feedback on that, or I think this is one of the last sessions I'll do for now, unless I come up with a new topic. So if you want me to write about anything, or if you want me to host another session or whatever, you can either just reach out to me, we'll hop on a one-on-one, or give me inspiration for a new blog post or a new session I can host for you guys.